At this point, it's probably not a secret that I'm an obsessive bookworm. I hoard books like Smog hoards the Arkenstone, and I managed to read more than 100 books this year. Books are my life, whether it be collecting them, reading them, or even writing them. And that's a passion I want to maintain as I head into the new year. While I don't necessarily plan to read 100 books this year, especially with many of the books I plan to read being on the longer side, my list is by no means small. It's worth noting that this list just covers my interest in fantasy. Any forays into classic literature or psychological drama will be given their own lists as the need comes. I also want to note that I reserve the right to change my mind. Being something of a mood reader, I might give fantasy a break and dive into my other passion, which is classic literature written by female authors, or even explore the genre of gothic horror further. This isn't to say I won't be reading fantasy first and foremost, but there's a chance I won't get to everything, though I'm going to try my best. With all that out of the way, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about books, discuss characters and literature, obsess over Twilight, and offer the occasional writing advice. If that sounds like your cup of tea, hit that subscribe button. In total, I hope to read 25 stories this year. Now, I'll technically be reading more than 25 novels, since I've grouped series under one entry, and new books may be added to the list, or taken away as the year progresses. But without further ado, here are the fantasy books I hope to read in 2024. Number 1, the Fourth Wing series. Spend any amount of time on BookTok and you will have heard of Rebecca Yarrow's latest hit series. The popularity of these books is such that the sequel, Iron Flame, was released before the first book could even get a paperback edition. These novels are notoriously difficult to get a hold of, owing to their popularity, and many readers strive to acquire special editions and copies with spreages, or sprayed edges. My own copy of Iron Flame actually went missing, but Amazon was great about sending me a replacement. I don't know if some worker had a teen daughter or not, but one has to wonder. Given how big these books have become, it wouldn't shock me in the least if someone had stolen the book. I throw no blame on Amazon, since they were great about sending me another copy. But if that doesn't underscore how challenging it is to get a hold of these books, I don't know what will. I'm not sure what my expectations should be. Given the praise the series has received, I'm expecting something along the lines of ACOTAR. As a fan of Sarah J. Maas and Twilight, I'm hoping these books will be reasonably entertaining. I'm not expecting the depth of Shakespeare, and criticisms about the series are starting to come out of the woodwork. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm anxious to start off my reading year strong with something that's both easy to read and addicting. Number 2, the Stormlight Archive. I started my journey into the works of Brandon Sanderson last year. The bulk of my Christmas money in 2023 was spent on his books, but my gamble paid off, and I enjoyed every one of his novels, including both his series and his standalones. However, I haven't yet started his supposed magnum opus, the Stormlight Archive. Readers swear by these books especially. Most say they're better than anything else Sanderson has written. And if that's the case, then it's a good bet I'll enjoy them. I've loved all of his books so far, so how could I go wrong with the cream of the crop? The series isn't completed yet, but I've noticed that Brandon Sanderson is good about tying up loose ends, at least when it comes to the main story. Though he always leaves his books open to sequels, with hints dropped towards the end, he's good about telling satisfying, self-contained stories. He doesn't write the kinds of cliffhangers that disrupt your sleep. which I appreciate. Though the series is only about halfway through, I can take comfort in knowing that each story will be fulfilling on its own. Number 3, The Wheel of Time. While the Stormlight archives are on the longer side, they are by no means the lengthiest entry on this list. That honor goes to the Wheel of Time series, a series I've heard about repeatedly within the fantasy community. Compared to Tolkien, with some readers even suggesting that Robert Jordan takes what made Lord of the Rings great and does it better, this fantasy epic is prominent on nearly every top fantasy books list you can find. Booktubers sing its praises endlessly, and as someone who loves the Lord of the Rings series, it piqued my interest. Plus, I can only hear about something for so long before I get FOMO. While I've enjoyed shorter, more accessible books, I'm no stranger to lengthy epics, and as someone who has read both Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, I'm eager to give this series a try. I already purchased the whole lot of the main series books, getting them at a steep discount from someone on Facebook Marketplace for $60. So my fingers are crossed that I'll enjoy this series. Also, Brandon Sanderson completed the novels when Robert Jordan passed away, so knowing that the series' conclusion was handled by an author I already enjoy is a bonus. Number 4, the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. Given how many fantasy epics are on my list, it makes sense that I would need something lighter and shorter. I'll make no secret about my enjoyment of YA literature, and after completing the Caravel trilogy, I was impatient to get my hands on the spin-off series, which starts with Once Upon a Broken Heart. All I really know about these new books is that Jax makes an appearance, and that's all I need to know. Jax might be an asshole, but he's the closest I'll ever come to reading dark romance, and I refuse to be ashamed. Interestingly, Caravel wasn't an immediate favorite for me. While I liked the first book, I wasn't obsessed. However, Caravel was one of those series, at least for me, that improved as it went on. Once Stephanie Garber introduced the idea of the Fates and placed more focus on the other sister, Tella, I was hooked. I couldn't put the books down, and I burned through them within a few days. Granted, some readers have said that the new series didn't grab them as much as the original books, but plenty of readers still enjoyed them, and they make frequent appearances on BookTok. With the third book having just been released, I've no doubt of their positive reception, and I look forward to losing myself in a fun, whimsical, and occasionally dark world for a few days. Number 5, the Crescent City series. As noted at the start of this video, I'm a Sarah J. Maas fan. While others might be sick of hearing about her, I'm a genuine fan. As someone who loves Twilight, I feel like Sarah J. Maas takes a lot I liked from the series and does it even better. I just love the way she handles her characters, and how she dives into their psychology and relationships. Other readers might be sick of trauma, but I always find trauma fascinating, and I enjoyed how Maas took her characters through their problems, their grief, and their struggles to relate to others, in addition to the more traditional fantasy elements. Despite my passion for her books, though, I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading the Crescent City novels. I have noticed that they're not as talked about as ACOTAR or Throne of Glass, but enough people seem to be passionate about them. And all I do know about the series is that it ties into ACOTAR somehow. All of the ACOTAR books brought up the idea of multiple universes, with Amren, one of the primary characters, having come from one of these alternate worlds. Throne of Glass also teased the interconnectedness of Maas's worlds, so I'm excited to see how Crescent City takes this further. An Avengers-style series that brought everything together would be my dream come true. But regardless of what happens, I'm thrilled to dive into more of Sarah's work, as she's one of my buy everything she's written authors. Number 6, the Red Queen series. Given the longer books on this list, I need my share of YA to break things up. and Red Queen seems as good a book as any to give me a quick fix. I've seen this book on BookTok repeatedly, so I'm interested to see if it's worth the hype or not. As someone who has enjoyed Twilight, Shatter Me, and The Selection, it sounds like something I'd enjoy. Certainly the premise is compelling enough. Those with silver blood have powers, and are the elite of the world, while those with red blood, simply called the Reds, are the downtrodden underclass. It's not the newest idea in the world, the whole haves and have-nots trope. But I like the idea of there being different blood colors, and powers attached to those. The heroine of the story upsets the status quo when she is revealed to have special powers, despite her blood being red. Discovered by the upper echelon, she's pushed into disguising herself as a silver and trying to navigate their world. Again, it sounds like a fairly standard YA book, and I'm not expecting anything groundbreaking. People have also noted that the sequels weren't as good as the first book, but I'm still willing to read the whole series, if just so I can have something lighter to read. Other readers have complained that the later books get boring, because they spend time on politics. But as one of those weirdos who enjoyed the Star Wars prequels and Palpatine's political maneuvers, I'm hopeful that the books will at least keep me entertained, even if they don't impress me. If the series can be as good as The Selection, I won't be disappointed. Number 7. The Red Rising series. One of the biggest complaints against the Red Queen series was that it supposedly stole its chief idea from this science fiction series. As such, I'd love to compare the two and see for myself exactly how similar they are. Personally, I wouldn't go as far as to accuse Victoria Aveyard of stealing her ideas from Pierce Brown. While Red Rising also uses the idea of a downtrodden class of Reds who are oppressed, in this series by golds instead of silvers, the idea of an underdog class oppressed by a group of elites is by no means an invention of either author. You might just as soon accuse Aveyard of stealing from Brandon Sanderson, given his treatment of the nobility and the ska people they've enslaved. Red Rising, for its part, has been compared to The Hunger Games, but at 5 books and 7 in total planned, it's able to go deeper than a trilogy can, exploring not only rebellion, but the aftermath. I already want to read the series for its own sake, being a huge Hunger Games fan. And exploring the parallels between the series and Red Queen is just the cherry on top for me. I know they're science fiction and not fantasy, but this is my list, and the genres are similar enough that I have no problem bending the rules a little bit. Number 8. Tress of the Emerald Sea. Returning to Brandon Sanderson, I'm impatient to read Tress of the Emerald Sea. In my opinion, it was a stroke of genius on Sanderson's part to release this book, as well as the other 2 secret projects. Tress of the Emerald Sea has become a BookTok darling, and this is interesting because it has appealed to another demographic, namely those who are more interested in casual YA fare. In a sense, Sanderson has bridged the gap with this work, easing YA fans into potentially more complex works. The audiences for The Cruel Prince are ACOTAR versus the audience for Wheel of Time and Mistborn are often distinct demographics, separated by age, gender, and taste. But Tress of the Emerald Sea is that rare book which both cohorts can agree on. For those who have never read a Brandon Sanderson novel, it sounds like an accessible entry point, and it's supposedly inspired by The Princess Bride. Brandon Sanderson has never failed to impress me with his sheer originality, and his secret projects have all been unique, but Tress was easily the biggest book of this year. And as a Sanderson fan and a lover of casual BookTok reads, I have had FOMO twice over when it comes to this book. It's on my Christmas list, and my fingers are crossed that I'll finally get to read the latest Sanderson classic everyone is raving about. Number 9. The Lost Metal. My Brandon Sanderson list doesn't stop with Tress. Brandon Sanderson also came out with The Lost Metal, a sequel to his ongoing Wax and Wayne series, which exists within the larger framework of the Mistborn saga. Since I've already read all the other Mistborn novels, this one is time sensitive. After all, as a sequel, it's reliant on me remembering what happened before. As such, I don't want to wait too long to read this book, as I'm eager to return to a cast of characters I've grown to love. I adore all of the main characters, but Wayne especially always makes me smile. And for all their rough edges, there's something very endearing about this particular group. Sanderson always writes distinct characters, but these characters are charming because of their flaws, rather than in spite of them. And so I'm anxious to see where their lives are headed next. Number 10. The Kingdom of Lost Heart series. The Kingdom of the Lost Heart saga is another BookTok darling, but it also has the distinction of showing how a self-published author can excel. Carissa Broadbent has truly made it as a writer, as her books can be purchased alongside the likes of Sanderson within brick-and-mortar stores. But that's not all. Adored by fans, these books have been compared to the works of Sarah J. Maas, which naturally intrigued me. Even the premise, along with the cover art, gave me distinct Maas vibes, and the character on the front instantly made me think of Selena from Throne of Glass. Readers have said this is a good series to read if you've read all of Sarah J. Maas's work and need something similar. Since I plan to read the Crescent City books, these would be a natural follow-up, should I find myself craving more of the same. And the story itself intrigues me, regardless of how similar it ends up being to ACOTAR, as I always enjoy stories which follow female underdogs. Number 11. Kushal's Dart. Returning to the world of epic fantasy, Kushal's Dart is a series that has long been on my radar. From what I've heard, the world building is rich, and top fantasy books lists make frequent mention of this series. I've seen booktubers recommend it, but I'd already heard of the books on my own, and was intrigued by the premise. The story follows a courtesan, so there's sure to be some spice, but as someone who has read Game of Thrones, ACOTAR, and the works of Anne Rice, that's hardly a deterrent for me. There's certain to be plenty of scheming and drama, not unlike what we see in Game of Thrones. And again, this is another series with a female heroine who comes into her own despite her relative disadvantage. These books are on the longer side. On receiving them, I was shocked by how thick each novel was, but my surprise was pleasant. This series might even serve as a good warm-up before I tackled the even lengthier Wheel of Time. Number 12. American Gods. With all the series on my list, we finally come to a standalone. This is another book that has been on my radar for some time, and being a book I purchased last Christmas, it's overdue for a read. The premise alone sounds like a lot of fun to me. I'm a nerd when it comes to mythology. I love reading about gods, goddesses, and the shenanigans they get into. And my favorite parts of the Iliad were always the portions when the gods showed up and started screwing things up. As someone who's enjoyed the original Percy Jackson books, this book sounds like a more adult take on a similar idea, that of ancient beings running around unseen throughout a modern North America. From what I know, Golman brings multiple pantheons together, which is even better, since I not only enjoy Greek mythology, but mythology as a whole. Neil Gaiman's writing has been hit and miss with me. While I liked Good Omens, it wasn't my favorite book of all time. though certainly I appreciated its humor and the characters themselves. However, I loved Coraline, and American Gods promises to be fun, but potentially more serious as well. At any rate, this book has sat on my shelf long enough, making it a priority this year. Number 13, Watership Down. I first saw the Watership Down film as an adult, and I'm kind of glad I did. At first glance, Watership Down looks like it will be something along the lines of Secret of Nim. Dark and dealing with mature subject matter, but ultimately safe for children. Little did I expect just how dark the film could be, though, as there's actual gore, the more prominent for the cartoon style employed. The image of that animal bleeding from the neck as a snare digs into his flesh is burned into my mind, and I can only imagine the reaction small children must have had to the scene. It's been years since I've seen the film, but I do remember enjoying it, and I've always wondered how the book compared, if it was as dark or darker than the movie it inspired. On a happier note, I remember the more fantastical elements, including the overarching mythology, being fascinating, and the book is certain to explore that in greater detail. The book follows a group of rabbits, but I'd say it's safe to classify it as a fantasy, in the way you might classify the Redwall or Warrior series as fantasies. And it should make for a good standalone to break up all the longer series I plan to read. 14. The Shades of Magic series. V.E. Schwab is another of those authors I've yet to read, but one I've heard about repeatedly. Better known on BookTok for her Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, she nevertheless developed a following for another big series, The Shades of Magic. For a long time, I resisted reading this series. Unfair as it is, I think the cover art put me off. It's great cover art, being artsy and eye-catching, but it didn't give me the vibe I usually look for. Plus, there were other books I wanted to read more, just based on their premises and overall feel. However, I have since read those books, and my FOMO dictates that now is the time. Having completed everything from The Cruel Prince to ACOTAR, I have no excuses left. Schwab is continually praised, and I want to know what all the hype is about. The idea of there being multiple versions of the world is always one that appeals to me, and Schwab was playing around with the idea of multiple universes before Marvel decided to take the idea and overdo it. If I enjoy the series, I might also pick up The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, or Schwab's own take on the superhero genre. But for now, this is the series I'm most anxious to try. Next on the list, we have House in the Cerulean Sea. Like V.A. Schwab, T.J. Klune is another author I've heard about, but haven't actually read. What I do know is that his ideas sound delightful. There really is no other word for it. Usually, I like books that are moody or angst-fueled, but there's something about the concepts Klune proposes that grabs me. Whether it's a collection of conscious objects or an orphanage filled with magical and potentially dangerous children, Klune's books sound charming, and House in the Cerulean Sea is regularly recommended on BookTok. Though all of his books sound good, this is the one that gets talked about the most, and so it seems as good a starting point as any when it comes to getting a taste of Klune's work. Number 16. The Broken Earth trilogy. Yet another series that frequently makes recommendations lists, the Broken Earth series has been on my radar for some time. N.K. Jemisin is one of the biggest names in fantasy right now, and while she's written dozens of books and won several awards, this is the series that gets mentioned the most. As a die-hard fantasy fan, it seems as good a series as any to tackle. Admittedly, I don't know as much about the series as I would like, but from what I gather, the series, as implied by the title, focuses on a dying world. Seasons come in cycles, and the current one is catastrophic. In some ways, this book could be classified as sci-fi, but as it's often listed with top fantasy reads, I'm including it here. N.K. Jemisin is by no means the only author to play around with seasons that shift by years rather than months. George R. R. Martin also explored this concept with his idea of years-long winters and summers, but Jemisin takes the idea further, plunging the reader and the protagonist into the worst world she possibly can. Given Jemisin's track record and the praise that's being offered to these books, my expectations are high. As someone who hopes to read all the best fantasy has to offer, I feel I've neglected this series for too long. Next, I'd like to talk about the Ninth House books. Though I've read all of the Grishaverse books, I've yet to read Leigh Bardugo's Ninth House. Personally, I really enjoyed the Grishaverse books, but from what I've been told by other readers, that doesn't guarantee I'll enjoy these books. The Grishaverse series was primarily written for young adults into high fantasy, whereas the Ninth House books, set in the real world, are dark urban fantasies written with an older audience in mind. Having glanced over the premise, I still expect to enjoy these books. While I'm not going into them expecting Grishaverse, I am a reader who's enjoyed fantasy widely. I've read plenty of urban fantasy, horror, and paranormal romance. These books promise ghosts, cults, and psychological problems, all of which sound intriguing to me. The books have had their complaints, such as some noting Alex's lack of withdrawal symptoms, but they seem easy enough to overlook. Appearing frequently on BookTok, it's clear that the series has its own following, and with Hellbent having just been released, it's obvious that interest hasn't waned. As I've enjoyed Bardugo's writing so far, my interest is piqued. Next up, we have the Scholomance series. Continuing with YA fantasy, these books are better known by the title of the first novel, A Deadly Education. It's your standard magic school premise. Someone is whisked away to a magical education center and pitted against the unknown. From Harry Potter to the Zodiac Academy, Naomi Novak can hardly take credit for the concept. That said, people seem to have enjoyed her take on the subgenre. I don't know much about the series personally, but my FOMO has made me curious about them, and honestly, sometimes I prefer to know less about a book before I read it. It's rare for a book synopsis to grab me by itself. There were books that, on the surface, didn't sound that interesting to me, but which I ended up loving. All this to say that, while I'm not obsessed with the whole magic school trope, despite my love for Harry Potter and Wednesday, I always enjoy a great story. And hearing so many people rave about this book has left me wondering if it's worth the hype or not. At number 19, we have The Stolen Heir duology. Since the second book doesn't come out until the spring, I've held off reading the first. I don't even plan to purchase it until sometime in March, as I'm keen to read the pair as a whole. I can't stand cliffhangers, and having read the Cruel Prince trilogy, I know how Holly Black likes her twists and turns. I really enjoyed The Cruel Prince. Jude was one of my favorite YA protagonists, but all of the characters were fascinating. What I loved was that nobody was wholly good or bad. You have an adoptive father who literally murdered his daughter's biological parents, and our first introduction to Cardan involves him ripping off some poor fairy's wings. Jude is hardly squeaky clean, shedding her own allotment of blood, and her twin sister Taryn is also devious but in her own way. The Cruel Prince also belongs to a wider fantasy world, which includes the modern fairy tale trilogy, another series I enjoyed, though it was a grittier urban fantasy. Moreover, How the King of Elfheim Learned to Hate Stories was a charming novella, one which made me nostalgic for a true return to the world Holly Black crafted. Overall, I love the universe Holly Black has created, which makes these two books high anticipation reads. I've avoided reviews, There hasn't been as much fanfare around these books as The Cruel Prince used to receive. But I can't tell if that's due to a decline in quality, they're having to compete with the original series, or the fact they're simply not finished. It could be that many readers, like me, are waiting for a complete series. I breezed through the Cruel Prince trilogy within a couple days, and so it makes sense that I'd want to read the two books together. If I can expect to finish book one in a day, I don't want to wait several months to read the second half of the adventure, especially if Holly Black, in YA fashion, decides to conclude The Stolen Heir with a cliffhanger. Honestly, I just don't like cliffhangers, so I've delayed reading book 1 until book 2 is out. Number 20, Fledgling. From the moment I heard about this book, I was desperate to read it. Several times I've come close to buying it, but I've decided that this is going to be the year I finally cave. Though I've mentioned how dry I typically find the synopsis of any given book, that wasn't the case with Fledgling. For its premise alone, I'm interested. I'm a hardcore vampire fan, and this book appears on nearly all of the best vampire books lists. Bumping shoulders with Interview with a Vampire and Dracula, it's regarded as a classic among vampire enthusiasts. For those fascinated with the idea of a vampire trapped in the body of a child, Fledgling promises to deliver. Claudia's story might have been tragic, but Fledgling takes the concept further. Not only is the vampire in question black, but she is also suffering from a memory lapse, making her unaware of the fact that, despite her youthful appearance, she's actually 50 years old. Everything about this story's premise has me hooked. There are some books I just know I'm going to love, based on the synopsis alone, and this is one of them. I'd already love the book because it follows a vampire, but the whole idea of a child discovering she is actually a 50-year-old vampire is one I can't forget. At number 21, we have The Wolf and the Woodsman. In regards to books I expected to love from the get-go, I had the pleasure of reading Juniper and Thorn this year, and I wasn't disappointed. Juniper and Thorn was considered controversial, and opinions within the reviews were divided. But Juniper and Thorn, funnily enough, was one of those books, for me, where even the bad reviews made me want to read it more. As someone who has read her fair share of Stephen King and The Exorcist, this was by no means the most horrific book out there. And while it was unsettling, I couldn't say I was upset or traumatized by the content. Instead, I enjoyed the story for what it was. I thought Ava Reid balanced the psychological horror and the fantasy elements quite well, and her prose gave me vivid mental pictures, something not every author can do. However, while Juniper and Thorn is Reid's most well-known book, it was by no means her first. She began her foray into dark fairy tale retellings with The Wolf and the Woodsman, and if I had to pick a fairy tale I love to see retold, it's Little Red Riding Hood. I enjoyed how Reid handled Juniper and Thorn, and having had a taste of her writing, I'm open to seeing how she addresses a myth I'm more familiar with. From what I can tell, the book was still well received, and has to be credited as the story that made Reid's name in the first place. As such, it's at the top of the books I plan to read this year. Number 22, The Crowns of Nyaxia. I was already interested in this book because of the hype surrounding it. Of the two series Carissa Broadbent wrote, The Kingdom of Broken Hearts actually sounded like the most intriguing to me, given how much it reminded me of Throne of Glass. But The Crowns of Nyaxia has since superseded it, at least in terms of discussion. These books appear constantly on BookTok. Moreover, I'm likely to love them for another reason. They're centered on vampires. As noted earlier, Carissa Broadbent has been compared to Sarah J. Maas. A Sarah J. Maas styled story featuring vampires would be a dream series for me. As someone who's obsessed with Twilight and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, making me a fan of vampire romance generally, I'm impatient to read these. They sound like everything I love and more, and I want to decide for myself if they live up to their reputation. Coming to number 23, we have The Song of Achilles. Out of all the books on BookTok, The Song of Achilles has been among the most consistent. Reportedly a book apt to make you cry, readers haven't been able to stop talking about this book. As someone who loves Greek mythology and who's read everything from Percy Jackson to the original Iliad, I can't help being interested. Though presented among fluffy romances and easygoing YA books, I've always gotten the impression this book was deeper. I've enjoyed most of the popular books peddled on the BookTok platform, and loved a handful like the ACOTAR series, but this seems to be a book that has stayed with people. And while I'm not often given to big shows of emotion, I always appreciate a book that can make me cry. I don't cry often, but if this ends up being one of the few books that breaks through my stone heart, I'll consider it a success. Having read the Iliad, I know I'm not in for a cheerful adventure or a happy ending, but I want to see how Madeline Miller reinvents a familiar legend. Number 24, Cirque. As with The Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller's Cirque became another bestseller. Incidentally, I nearly bought this book on a whim when I saw it on the shelves, simply because it looked interesting. While I curbed my impulse buying at the time, it was only a few months later I became acquainted with the book's hype, along with that of its sister book, Song of Achilles. As with Song of Achilles, Cirque takes an iconic character from Greek mythology and retells their story. Feminine explorations of female characters in Greek myth, overlooked in their own ages, have generated a whole new subgenre, and Madeline Miller can be thanked for turning such books into a trend. We've since seen books following the stories of everyone from Medusa to Clytemnestra, but Cirque remains the definitive Greek mythology retelling of the decade. And, overshadowed only by Song of Achilles, it's become one of the bigger fantasy reads, even for those without a more specific interest in Greek legends. As noted in my last point, I'm a nerd when it comes to Greek mythology. I also have a fondness for female-led stories written by female authors, which makes this book a must-read for me, even outside of its popularity. The fact I almost bought it earlier when I hadn't even heard of it says enough. At number 25, we have Beloved. Easily the most tragic book on this list, making even Song of Achilles seem cheerful, I wondered if I should even classify this book as a fantasy. After all, the central idea is a dramatic one, and one rooted in the very real and horrifying reality of slavery. This book, already a classic in its own right, could just as easily sit on a literary list. That said, this story does feature a ghost. I've seen it classified as a fantasy, despite the drama-based focus, and during Halloween it was listed among the horror section, though that could have been more from the result of the tragedy itself rather than the appearance of a ghost. For those who don't know, Beloved is about the death of a baby girl at the hands of her mother. Rather than watch her daughter grow up to be a slave, the main character of the story makes the difficult decision to kill her instead. Not even old enough to be given a true name, the little girl is simply buried in a grave with the word beloved written across it. It's a tragedy on so many levels, and one which haunts the grieving mother, figuratively and literally. It's a ghost story, but also a literary drama, and while I'm usually drawn to the paranormal, I also appreciate a solid drama. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of those books that makes me emotional. Even thinking about the concept, as someone who would like to be a mother someday, makes me feel sad, and while I know this won't be an easy read, it does feel like an essential one. It's a classic that I'll regret not reading, tragic as it may be. When it comes to my reading goals, I'm ambitious. In the genre of fantasy alone, there are 25 stories I would like to read this year. Books may be added or removed, and I reserve the right to change my mind. But for now, these are the books I'm concentrating on. With series like The Wheel of Time and the Stormlight Archives on my list, I'm certain to be kept busy with the series alone. This list also doesn't cover those books outside the fantasy genre I plan to read, as I'm also planning to dive into the genres of Gothic, horror, and classic literature with a select group of female writers. Over the year, I plan to give updates on my reading, and while I don't plan to review every single book I finish, I look forward to discussing those which have the most impact on me. Of course, book lists are nothing new on this channel, and last year I also made a point of listing my top 10 books I read that year. If you'd like to see which books I loved in 2022, hit the video on the left, and if you'd like to learn about 6 Tolkien books which aren't a Lord of the Rings, click the video on the right. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!